So there's a pro-life event called the Susan B. Anthony. Well, hold on now. I think the Susan B. Anthony thing is a group, but they're hosting some sort of a pro-life event. And the whole point of the Susan B. Anthony group is to be, anti-abortion. Anyway, so they had this event. A bunch of big-name conservatives were invited and, partook in this event. And Tucker Carlson interviewed a bunch of them. So he sat down with Mike Pence. Now, the reason this is super interesting is because these guys low-key hate each other, maybe even high-key. Just look at this look on screen at where I pause this in the video. Look at how Pence is looking at Tucker. There's a seething hatred barely underneath the surface here. Now, why is that? Because Carlson publicly has positioned himself as a Trump simp. Now, it's funny because behind the scenes, he actually hates Trump. In fact, he said, we saw the internal Fox News emails and correspondence that were released as part of the lawsuit from Dominion. And he says, I hate Trump with a burning passion. Literally nothing good has come out of the Trump era. These are things Tucker has said. So behind the scenes, he's a little weasel. Behind the scenes, he has a totally different opinion. He knows the election wasn't stolen, for example. But in front of the scenes, singing a different tune. Okay. So Tucker's a little weasel charlatan. That's obvious. Everybody knows that. And he interviews Pence here. And they're going to get into a number of areas where they have massive differences. So first, I believe we're going to do January 6th. And then after that, we're going to get to Ukraine. Let's listen.
So we spent, when the BLM riots happened and the riot in front of the White House that injured more law enforcement personnel than January 6th, we spent a lot of time talking about why those rioters were mad. They were mad about systemic racism and the death of George Floyd, et cetera. Why do you think the people who swarmed the Capitol on January 6th were mad? And why haven't we talked about that?
I just have to pause to reflect on that question. I love this. It's the whole, the January 6thers were victims. They were victims. They were oppressed. There was legitimate reason for them to be angry. Now, maybe they went a little over the line. But we must sympathize with what they were doing, why they were doing what they were doing. God damn it, man. Now, here's a guy who was threatened by this group. They had a noose, and they were chanting, hang Mike Pence. Let's see what he says.
Well, first off, I would tell you that I think the January 6th committee was a partisan committee in the Congress of the United States. And it failed its historic mission of bringing the facts forward.
Yep.
And I know your commitment to bringing all the facts to the American people, Tucker. And I know we're grateful for that. The truth of the matter is, as some members of the staff of the January 6th committee said after it adjourned, they spent all their time focused so much on one individual and on placing blame that they spent very little time focusing on law enforcement failures that happened that day and intelligence failures that happened that day. And I hold to the view that we can never let this happen again. We can never allow the capital of the greatest nation on earth to be subject to a riot for any purpose, for any motivation. And for that reason, we need to understand why law enforcement that day was not better equipped, better prepared, where the intelligence failures were. And I believe that in time we'll have those answers.
Amen. But I wonder, though, again, about motive, since these were, and I'm not excusing any act of violence ever anywhere, including on January 6th. However, they were American citizens. Most of them didn't commit acts of violence, and they were really mad. And they were mad because they thought the election was unfair.
Right.
And I wonder why more time hasn't been spent by either party reassuring Americans that our elections are real.
Maybe because they're wrong. Have you considered that? They have this belief, and it's a false belief, and it's a belief that was put into their minds by the poison spewed by Fox News and One America News Network and Newsmax on a daily basis, of which you're also partly responsible for, Tucker. Maybe it's as simple as that. Maybe there was colossal brainwashing that occurred. There are bad actors who are charlatans and conmen and frauds who were spewing a bogus narrative for political convenience and to keep eyeballs on the TV, and they were wrong. So in a situation like that, how do you address it? Well, you go after the people who broke the law, and you bring them to justice, and you correct the record. You correct the record by giving actual evidence and facts as to what occurred. So what actually occurred? We know what occurred. There was over 60 lawsuits, and the Trump campaign lost nearly every single one of them because there was no evidence that the election was that the election was rigged. Biden won by over 7 million votes, and we're really having this conversation? Oh, they're mad, and maybe it's legitimate, and I'll ask you again, what about the motivations? You know what the motivations are. You know what the motivations are. But you're trying to, portray them as a victim, or they have real concerns, and maybe the concerns should be addressed. Or maybe you guys should stop propagandizing people like this and when the inevitable consequences of it are so dire.
That all votes are counted, that the electronic voting machines, which no one seemed to trust 10 years ago, now are infallible, why mail-in voting is a good thing. Like, why doesn't anybody try to reassure the public that the mechanics of voting are legit?
The Democrats are trying to do that, but then you attack them every time they try to do that. Why aren't they doing this thing? Because when they do it, you turn around and go, well, that's bogus. That's BS. Don't tell these people their concerns aren't legitimate. But they're not legitimate. So what do you want me to tell you? Look, if you want to make a deal right now to get rid of electronic voting machines, I'll make that deal with you. I have no problem with that whatsoever. But guess what? It wouldn't have changed the results of the last election at all. Not one iota. Oh, Jesus Christ. It's just so easily. Guys, we did an audit in the entire state of Arizona. Why? Because that was like one of the states that the Trump supporters and the Stop the Steal people, they were like, oh, we know this state was stolen. There's no doubt about it. So they did an audit, and you know what they found? Joe Biden won by more votes than what we thought he won by on election day. Now, when that happened, did all these people turn around and go, oh, well, I guess I was wrong. I guess this wasn't a stolen election. I guess it wasn't rigged. They didn't do that because that's the hallmark of a conspiracy. Any evidence that disproves your theory, you just spin it as evidence in favor of your theory.
Do you think the last election was fair?
Well, as I said on January 6th in my communication to the Congress, and I've said many times since, there were irregularities in the 2020 election. There's no question.
He's already conceding too much because that's not true. That's just not true. There weren't any more irregularities than a normal election, and the number of irregularities are infinitesimally small, and they wouldn't impact the outcome in any way, shape, or form. So you're already cucking yourself way too much. Now, I'm sure he's going to go on to ameliorate that statement and soften it, but still, you're agreeing to their framework and their premise, which is not going to change anybody's mind. To be fair, I don't know if it would change anybody's mind at all, even if he came out aggressively on the correct side of this. But it's just, this is classic Mike Pence.
There were about a half a dozen states that changed the rules of elections in the name of COVID.
Yep.
And that undermined public confidence in the outcome.
Only after right-wing propaganda spewed relentlessly at the top of their lungs to mislead people. That's what happened. People wouldn't have connected these dots if there wasn't a giant media apparatus forcing this narrative out there.
Now, at the end of the day, we brought more than 60 lawsuits, states engaged in recounts. And when states ultimately certified and courts upheld those changes in virtually every instance, and ultimately we were able to determine that the changes, there's no evidence that the changes had changed the outcome of the election in any way. I knew that my duty was clear that day. But candidly, as I've said before, President Trump's words that day were reckless. I believe whatever his intentions in that moment, it endangered me and my family and everyone that was at the Capitol that day. I believe history will hold him accountable for that, just as the law will hold everyone that engaged in acts of violence.
But to the rest of us who weren't there, who were just participating or trying to in our democracy, 10 years ago, Democrats said, look, electronic voting machines can never be secure. And of course, that's obviously true. Anything electronic can be subverted. Real countries don't use electronic voting machines. Are you confident that a country with electronic voting machines, ours, can have an election that you're participating in that everyone can trust?
Well, I believe we can, but I welcome the fact that since 2020, Republican-led states around the country have enacted election integrity reforms. I'm somebody that believes that, and Indiana was the first state to do this. I'm somebody that believes that you ought to be required to give a picture ID when you go in to vote. We ought to have voter ID in every state in America.
Right back to the standard talking points. Jesus Christ. And what Tucker's doing here is soft election denialism. Hey, it's just reasonable questions. Hey, maybe we should just get rid of the electronic voting machines. Is that not reasonable? Okay, like I just said, I would agree to that. I will shake your hand on it, but let's stop pretending that would have changed the outcome of the last election at all. The dude won by over 7 million votes. It wasn't really that close. When we did the recounts, we saw what happened. So he's feeding into the narrative, and Pence is really not doing an aggressive job of pushing back on it because he doesn't want to anger the pro-Trump base, which is the majority of the Republican Party at this point.
But with regard to voting machines, I would tell you we had them in Indiana, but in Indiana and elsewhere, they produced paper ballots. Recounts were taken in states around the country. And I think it's absolutely essential that we do everything in our power to restore public confidence in the one-person, one-vote principle at the heart of this republic.
Why not just get rid of electronic voting machines and call it a day, and then we don't have to debate it?
If we had gotten rid of electronic voting machines, do you think that would have gotten rid of the Trump won conspiracy theories? I have a bridge to sell you if you're that dumb. it wouldn't have changed a goddamn thing. Because, by the way, some places that use the electronic voting machines, they do also have paper ballots. I remember there was a detailed breakdown of Mike Lindell. He pointed to a specific state and a specific voting district. And oh my God, watch this, guys. This is one that we know was stolen. And there was a detailed analysis, and it wasn't true. In fact, the electronic voting machine wasn't even connected to the internet. And he said it was hacked by like China or Venezuela or something through the internet. It's just, the narratives are just bogus. Now, by the way, Mike Pence goes on to say, like, yeah, I would agree to that, no problem. But also in our country, the states run the election, so they would have to do it on a state-by-state basis. Okay, fair enough. What Tucker is doing here is soft election denialism, just trying to make it seem more reasonable than it is, when he knows just as well as I do, even if you do get rid of the electronic voting machines, that wouldn't change a goddamn thing. Not a single thing. All right, I got more for you. Now they go in on Ukraine.
You recently met with Zelensky, according to news reports. And I'm wondering if during that meeting, as a prominent Christian leader, which you are in addition to your political views, you broached the question of his treatment of Christians within Ukraine. The Zelensky government has raided convents, arrested priests, has effectively banned a denomination, a Christian denomination, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church within Ukraine, has persecuted Christians. And I wonder if you raised that with him.
I did raise the issue when we were there. And I raised it with the leader of the Orthodox Church when I was visiting Kyiv and asked him about concerns about religious liberty. He assured me that the Zelensky government in Ukraine was respecting religious liberty, even while recognizing that there were very small elements of the Russian Orthodox Church that were being utilized for the purpose of advancing the Russian cause in Ukraine, and that they were taking steps to hold them to account. But the leader of the church at St. Michael's in Kyiv told me personally that he believed that the Zelensky government was respecting religious liberty. And I must tell you, other than the sanctity of life, there's no higher priority in my life than preserving the freedom of religion in America and championing religious liberty around the world.
I'm confused. On this question, it's very clear that the Zelensky government has arrested priests for having views they disagree with. That's not consistent with religious liberty. It's an attack on it, and we're funding it. And I'm just wondering how is it, and I don't mean to be disrespectful at all, but I sincerely wonder how a Christian leader could support the arrest of Christians for having different views.
Well, what I can tell you is I asked the Christian leader in Kiev if that was in fact happening, and he assured me that it was not. People were not being persecuted for their religious beliefs. Now,
he said
let me take a break here. I know we disagree on this strongly, but I respect your right to your opinion on Ukraine, and I trust you'll respect mine. Look, I've been to Ukraine now twice. My wife and I traveled into Ukraine a month after the initiation of hostilities. We traveled then with a group called Samaritan's Purse, providing Christian relief to the millions of Ukrainians, women and children of every age that had to flee that country in the face of the unprovoked Russian invasion that began a year and a half ago. I did return, took an 11-hour train ride into Kyiv, also again with Samaritan's Purse. We not only met with government leaders, but we met with Christian relief workers. We're literally rebuilding homes of people in small towns, little hamlets, that a year ago were being shelled by Russian tanks, while the people in that community were just sitting in their homes. I mean, the truth is, what I saw was not just evidence of war, but I saw evil. And I believe that it is in the interest of the United States of America to continue to give the Ukrainian military the resources that they need to repel the Russian invasion and restore their sovereignty.
Would you, may I ask, would you be, and I believe you have a good faith position on this, and we have disagreements on it, but I want to just, I can't let you elide over the question of the treatment of Christians and clergy.
I know, I heard
and
that
would
again.
you be, well, no, but hold on, would you be
problem is you don't
willing?
accept my answer. I just told you that I asked the religious leader in Kiev if it was happening. You asked me if I raised the issue, and I did.
And I'm saying
I also raised it with the Ukrainians, and I was told that there are religious leaders who have been working with the Russian military that is murdering people by the thousands.
Okay.
I mean, Tucker, look.
Wait, but hold on. Don't you think?
Let me explain to you what I think our national interest is there.
I would think you would have greater concern for religious liberty in Ukraine. And I'm surprised
I told you I raised the issue of religious liberty.
No, you spoke to one person who's clearly on one side of it, and there are many, many news reports that are not disputed by anybody that many clergy have been arrested in Ukraine. And I'm merely saying I may not agree with their views. I'm not Russian Orthodox. But you can't arrest clergy for having different views, period. Because if you do, you violate the basic tenet of religious liberty.
I won't, look, I want to be clear with you. I won't stand by it. I won't stand for it. If people are being persecuted for their religious beliefs, I won't stand for it. In any country with which a country of our nation is supporting or our allies are supporting,
yes.
Period, paragraph. But let me say to you, our national interest in Ukraine, I believe, is born of the fact that I spent 10 years on the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Representatives. I spent 4 years as vice president. I've met Vladimir Putin. Let me tell you, if Vladimir Putin overruns Ukraine, I have no doubt that in a short period of time, that Russian military is going to cross a border of a NATO country.
So they go on. By the way, they fight later on in this interview, too. Go watch the whole thing. But the crux of their argument here, the crux of the disagreement here is Tucker saying, hey, man, you're like a Christian leader and you care about religious liberty. This is what you say. But in Ukraine, we have a situation where Christian leaders are being locked up. So what do you have to say about that? You have people who are being locked up simply because of their faith, and you don't say a word about it because you support Ukraine against Russia. That's his argument. And Mike Pence's response is, I was there. I asked a Christian leader if it was happening. They said it wasn't happening. They said anybody who was arrested, they weren't arrested because of their religious faith. They were arrested functionally because they are Russian spies working with the Russian Orthodox Church and feeding them information and putting Ukrainian lives in danger. So that's his response. His response is nobody's actually being arrested because of their faith. They're being arrested because they're spies for the Russian government during wartime. That's his reaction. Now, Tucker, every time Pence makes that point, Tucker just reiterates his original point, which is, I thought you'd have more concern for religious freedom in Ukraine because you got these Christians being arrested for no reason at all. And Pence keeps trying to impress upon him, no, you're not understanding my position. My position is there is a fact that you're ignoring which complicates the picture, which is these aren't just people who have a different belief. They are working as Russian spies, right? And look, you got to keep it real, man. When it comes to Tucker, apparently he's so concerned about this, but has he ever said a goddamn word about the anti-war protesters in Russia, Russian citizens who are protesting Russia's invasion, and their asses were locked up? Remember that? It was at the very beginning of the war. There were these massive anti-war demonstrations, and then a lot of these anti-war protesters, bravely out there in a country with no freedom of speech, they ended up getting locked up. Now, was he out there saying, hey, you got to stand up for the free protest of these people in this country, trying to bring about peace? He didn't say a word about that. He's just seizing on it, particularly when it comes to Ukraine, because he wants to portray Ukraine effectively as the bad guy. So, look, when it comes to the issue overall, you guys know where I'm at. I think Mike Pence is way too hawkish. He's a neocon. He supports endless war. I think he plays willy-nilly with escalation in the crisis. I mean, he supports the cluster bombs, which are illegal under U.S. law and international law, going to Ukraine. That's definitely way too far. I think if he had his way, we would already be, a pube hair's length away from World War III. So I don't support his position on it, but I'm also not with Tucker Carlson on this because Tucker Carlson is effectively a Russia simp. He does the whole, tap dance of like poor Vladimir Putin was put upon, and it was a defensive invasion, and it was all because the West forced his hand on this, and I think that's bullshit. I don't think that's accurate. I don't think that's true by any stretch of the imagination. I think the Russian government and Putin have their list of grievances that they go to and their list of rationalizations that they go to. Hey, we had to do this, but it's no different than when the U.S. did that about Iraq. Yes, we're doing an illegal and offensive invasion against a country that didn't attack us, but here's our list of reasons. And so if you disagree with this, then I guess you're, sympathetic with the Iraqi government, right? The same thing is going on here. It's like, oh, here's my, I'm illegally and offensively invading a country that didn't attack us, but here's my list of grievances, and if you don't agree to it, I guess you're pro-Nazi in Ukraine. There's a lot of the garbage that I've heard. Is like you're pro-Azov battalion and neo-Nazi fighters if you are against an illegal and offensive invasion, which, by the way, again, I have a bridge to tell you if you think Putin's real goal is to denazify Ukraine. We all know that the Wagner Group, which was his top paramilitary, which now that's more complicated, but they have neo-Nazi elements as well, right? Putin said it in his invasion speech. He talked about we want to sort of restore the glory of the previous Russian Empire. He said it. He says he thinks Ukraine is a fake country. It is imperial hubris. That's what it is. That's what's leading him to do it. It is an imperialist invasion. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Now, the complicating factor is how much should the U.S. be involved, because the more we're involved, the more we're risking World War III, and I can't roll the dice with that. I'm not okay with that. I want Ukraine to be able to defend themselves and maintain their sovereignty, as I would want any sovereign country to be able to do that, repel an offensive invasion. But we need to be careful that we don't cross a line where, you really are playing with fire here, and two nuclear-armed powers on the brink of conflict, basically a proxy war going on, is not acceptable. So you got to get to the peace table, you got to negotiate, you got to use diplomacy, you got to find a way out of this. But effectively what we're looking at is a debate between a guy who is a massive Ukraine stan versus somebody who's a massive Russia stan, and the crux of the disagreement is brought up under the guise of, I care about religious liberty because there's Christians being arrested in Ukraine, which again, he doesn't accept the nuanced counter-argument from Pence, which is, they're not actually doing that. They're only going after people who are legit Russian spies. Now, by the way, there should be due process, right? There should be due process. We should make sure that if, to the extent anybody is getting locked up, you need to lock up people who are actually guilty of crimes, right? That's important. And I don't know if there's due process. In fact, there very well may not be there. But again, the criticism rings a little hollow from Tucker Carlson because he hasn't said a word about the anti-war protesters in Russia who are getting locked up simply because they're doing free protest and free speech and standing on the side of peace and being against an illegal invasion. Anyway, look, go watch the whole interview. These guys clearly despise each other, and it's obvious. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.